Sarah Mitchell had never imagined that a simple vacation photo would transform her life forever. The 34-year-old marketing executive from Denver had saved for 2 years to afford this dream trip to London. She had meticulously planned every detail, from the cozy bed and breakfast in Bloomsbury to the walking tours of historic landmarks. This was supposed to be her reward after a brutal divorce and a year of rebuilding her confidence. The morning of July 15th started like any other tourist day in London. Sarah woke up early, eager to make the most of her limited time in the city. She had already visited the Tower of London, Westminster Abbey, and the British Museum. Today's agenda included Buckingham Palace and the famous changing of the guard ceremony. She had read online that arriving early was essential to get a good viewing spot, so she left her hotel at 8 a.m., armed with her camera and a large coffee from the nearby cafe. The summer heat was already building as Sarah made her way through the bustling streets of London. Tourists and locals alike filled the sidewalks, creating a vibrant tapestry of languages and cultures. Street performers entertained crowds at various corners, their music mixing with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chime of Big Ben. Sarah felt alive in this environment, her camera capturing candid moments of city life as she walked. When she arrived at Buckingham Palace, the crowds were already forming along the gates. Families with children, elderly couples with guidebooks, and young backpackers all jostled for the best viewing positions. Sarah found herself squeezed between a large German tour group and a family from Japan who were taking countless selfies. The anticipation in the air was palpable as everyone waited for the ceremony to begin. The royal guard stood at their posts, motionless as statues in their iconic red tunics and tall black bearskin hats. Sarah had seen pictures of them countless times, but witnessing their discipline and precision in person was truly impressive. Their faces remained expressionless, their eyes focused straight ahead, completely unmoved by the chaos of tourists around them. It was a display of military bearing that commanded respect. As the ceremony began, Sarah raised her camera to capture the pageantry. The guards moved with synchronized precision, their movements sharp and deliberate. The crowd watched in respectful silence, broken only by the occasional whisper or the click of camera shutters. Sarah felt goosebumps as she watched this centuries-old tradition unfold before her eyes. This was exactly the kind of authentic cultural experience she had hoped for. However, as the morning progressed, the heat became more intense. The coffee Sarah had purchased earlier was now lukewarm, and the sugar had settled at the bottom of the cup. She had been standing in the same spot for over an hour, and her feet were beginning to ache. The crowds around her seemed to grow larger and more restless. Children were getting cranky, and adults were becoming impatient. The magical atmosphere was slowly giving way to discomfort and frustration. Sarah noticed one particular guard who stood closer to the crowd than the others. He was tall and young, probably in his early 20s, with a stern expression that never wavered despite the chaos around him. Tourists kept trying to get his attention, making faces, waving, and even calling out to him. Some took photos so close to his face that the camera flash was practically blinding. Yet he remained perfectly still, a testament to his training and professionalism. The heat was becoming unbearable, and Sarah's coffee had grown cold and bitter. She considered throwing it away, but didn't want to lose her prime viewing spot. The German tour group beside her was getting increasingly loud, their guide speaking through a small microphone that crackled with static. Behind her, the Japanese family's youngest child was crying, clearly overwhelmed by the noise and heat. As the ceremony continued, Sarah began to feel dizzy from the heat and the press of bodies around her. She tried to step back to get some air, but the crowd had grown so dense that movement was nearly impossible. The smell of sweat, sunscreen, and various foods created an overwhelming sensory experience. Her beautiful morning was turning into an endurance test. It was then that a particularly aggressive tourist pushed past Sarah, causing her to stumble forward. She tried to regain her balance, but the movement caused her to spill some of her coffee. The lukewarm liquid splashed onto the ground near her feet, and she felt embarrassed by the small accident. She looked around to see if anyone had noticed, grateful that the spill seemed minor and hadn't affected anyone else. But as she looked up, she realized that a few drops of coffee had traveled further than she thought. The young guard she had been observing was standing just a few feet away, and some of the coffee had landed on his pristine red tunic. Sarah's heart stopped as she saw the small brown stains on the immaculate uniform. The guard, however, remained motionless, his training preventing him from reacting to what had just happened. Sarah felt a wave of panic wash over her. She knew that the royal guards were not supposed to break character under any circumstances, but she also knew that she had just committed what could be considered an assault on a member of the Queen's Guard. The weight of her accident hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a tourist mishap. This was potentially a serious incident with legal consequences. The people around her began to notice what had happened. She could hear whispers in multiple languages, and she felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Some tourists were pointing, while others were discreetly taking photos of the stained uniform. Sarah wanted to disappear into the crowd, but she knew she couldn't just walk away from what she had done. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out what to do next. Should she approach the guard and apologize? Should she find a police officer? Should she try to clean the stain somehow? Every option seemed wrong, and the guard's continued silence and stillness made the situation even more surreal. She stood frozen, holding her nearly empty coffee cup, watching the small stains on the red fabric as if they might disappear if she stared hard enough. The ceremony continued around them, but Sarah's world had shrunk to just herself and the guard she had accidentally attacked with coffee. She could feel her vacation, her careful plans, and her peaceful morning crumbling around her. What had started as an innocent attempt to capture a perfect tourist moment had become something much more serious and complicated. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah realized that this incident would not simply fade away. The guard would eventually be relieved of his post, and the stains would be discovered by his superiors. There would be questions, investigations, and consequences. Her dream vacation was about to become a nightmare, and she had no idea how to stop the chain of events she had accidentally set in motion. The sound of marching feet and commands being shouted seemed to grow louder around her, but Sarah could barely focus on the ceremony anymore. All she could think about was the young man standing so stoically despite what she had done to him. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he was angry, whether he was worried about getting in trouble for the state of his uniform. As the changing of the guard ceremony reached its climax, Sarah knew that her real story was just beginning. The consequences of her accidental action were about to unfold, and she had no idea how dramatically they would change not just the rest of her vacation, but potentially the rest of her life. The morning sun beat down on the crowd, the coffee stains slowly drying on the guard's uniform, and Sarah Mitchell stood in the middle of it all, about to learn that sometimes the smallest accidents can have the biggest consequences. The ceremony concluded with its usual pomp and precision, but Sarah barely noticed the final marching sequences or the dispersal of the guards. Her attention remained fixed on the young guardsman, whose uniform now bore the evidence of her accident. As the formal proceedings ended, she watched with growing anxiety as the guards began to return to their posts or head back to their barracks. The crowd around Buckingham Palace started to thin out, with tourists moving on to their next destinations or seeking shade from the increasingly intense summer heat. Sarah found herself with more space to move, but she felt paralyzed by indecision. The rational part of her mind told her to simply leave, to blend in with the departing crowd, and hope that no one would connect her to the coffee stains. But her conscience wouldn't allow her to walk away from what she had done. As she stood there wrestling with her options, Sarah noticed a commotion developing near the palace gates. 2 police officers were approaching the area where the stained guard was positioned. Her stomach dropped as she realized that someone must have reported the incident. The officers moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the remaining crowd as if looking for someone specific. The guard she had accidentally splashed was finally given permission to move from his post. Sarah watched as he was approached by what appeared to be a superior officer, who immediately noticed the coffee stains on the pristine red uniform. Even from a distance, she could see the concern and displeasure on the officer's face as he examined the damage. The young guard's expression remained professional, but Sarah could imagine the stress he must be feeling. One of the approaching police officers, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes but a stern expression, began questioning witnesses in the crowd. Sarah overheard fragments of conversations in various languages as tourists tried to explain what they had seen. A young boy from the Japanese family pointed in Sarah's general direction, and she felt her heart race as the officer's attention turned toward her area of the crowd. The officer approached a group of German tourists first, speaking to them in careful English while they responded with enthusiastic but broken explanations. Sarah caught words like American woman and coffee accident being repeated several times. She realized that her nationality and the nature of the incident had already been established by multiple witnesses. There was no point in trying to hide or blend in anymore. Taking a deep breath, Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her experience in London. She walked directly toward the police officer, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched her empty coffee cup. The officer noticed her approach and studied her with the trained eye of someone experienced in reading people's guilt or innocence. "Excuse me, officer," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think you're looking for me. I'm the one who spilled coffee on the guard." The officer's expression shifted from investigative to somewhat surprised. In her experience, people rarely volunteered to confess to incidents involving the royal guards. Most tourists who got into trouble tried to disappear into the crowd or deny their involvement entirely. Sarah's immediate confession was both refreshing and concerning, as it suggested the incident might be more serious than a simple accident. "I see," the officer replied, pulling out a small notebook. "Could you tell me exactly what happened, miss?" Sarah explained the sequence of events, from the crowded conditions to being pushed by another tourist to the accidental spill. She was careful to emphasize that it was completely unintentional and that she had been trying to figure out the appropriate way to handle the situation. The officer listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the timing and circumstances. As they spoke, Sarah became aware that a small crowd was gathering around them. Other tourists, sensing drama, had slowed their departure to watch the proceedings. Some were discreetly taking photos or videos, and Sarah realized that her incident was probably already being shared on social media. The thought of becoming an internet sensation for all the wrong reasons added another layer of anxiety to her already overwhelming situation. The officer explained that assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard, even accidentally, was taken very seriously by British authorities. While Sarah's obvious distress and immediate confession suggested it was genuinely an accident, there would still need to be an official investigation. She would need to provide a formal statement, and there would likely be consequences beyond just an apology. "What kind of consequences?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. The officer explained that penalties could range from a formal warning to fines, and, in more serious cases, even brief detention or deportation. The severity would depend on various factors, including the intent behind the action, the level of damage caused, and the individual's cooperation with authorities. Sarah's immediate confession and obvious remorse would work in her favor, but the decision would ultimately be made by higher authorities. As they continued their conversation, the superior officer who had been examining the guard's uniform approached their group. He introduced himself as Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, and his bearing immediately commanded respect. His weathered face suggested decades of military service, and his eyes held the kind of authority that came from years of dealing with various situations involving the Royal Guards. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison examined Sarah carefully, as if trying to assess her character and intentions. He asked her to repeat her account of events, listening intently to every detail. His questions were more pointed than the police officers, focusing on her mental state, her alcohol consumption, and her general attitude toward British institutions and the royal family. Sarah answered each question honestly, explaining that she had the utmost respect for British traditions and that the incident was purely accidental. She mentioned that she had been looking forward to this trip for years and that seeing the changing of the guard ceremony had been one of her most anticipated experiences. The irony that this dream experience had turned into a nightmare was not lost on her. The lieutenant colonel's expression remained neutral throughout their conversation, but Sarah sensed that he was beginning to believe her story. When she mentioned that she had been pushed by another tourist, he asked for details about that individual. Unfortunately, Sarah realized she couldn't provide much useful information about the person who had caused her to stumble. In the crowd and confusion, she hadn't gotten a good look at them. Meanwhile, the young guard whose uniform had been stained was being questioned separately. Sarah could see him standing at attention while speaking to another officer, and she felt a pang of guilt knowing that her accident was now causing problems for him as well. She wondered if he would face any disciplinary action for the condition of his uniform, even though the incident was completely beyond his control. The police officer informed Sarah that she would need to accompany them to a nearby station to provide a formal statement. This wasn't an arrest, she was assured, but rather a necessary part of the investigation process. Sarah felt her vacation slipping away from her as she realized she would be spending the day dealing with legal procedures rather than exploring London. As they prepared to leave the palace area, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison made a decision that surprised everyone present. He approached Sarah directly and, in a voice that carried both authority and understanding, said that he believed her account of the incident was truthful. However, he explained, there would still need to be official consequences to maintain the dignity and security protocols surrounding the royal guards. The lieutenant colonel outlined what would happen next. Sarah would need to provide her formal statement, pay a fine for the cleaning and potential replacement of the damaged uniform, and attend a brief educational session about British royal protocols. Additionally, she would be required to write a formal letter of apology to the guard and to the commanding officer of his unit. While these consequences were serious, they were far less severe than what Sarah had been fearing. The lieutenant colonel explained that her immediate confession, obvious remorse, and cooperative attitude had all worked in her favor. Had she tried to flee or deny her involvement, the situation would have been handled very differently. As they walked toward the waiting police vehicle, Sarah felt a complex mixture of relief and continued anxiety. She was grateful that the consequences weren't more severe, but she was also acutely aware that her dream vacation had been fundamentally altered. Instead of spending the day exploring museums and historic sites, she would be navigating the British legal system and learning about royal protocols in a way she had never intended. The ride to the police station was quiet, with Sarah staring out the window at the London streets she had been so excited to explore. She thought about calling her sister back in Denver to explain what had happened, but she wasn't sure how to even begin that conversation. How do you tell someone that you accidentally assaulted a royal guard with coffee during what was supposed to be a peaceful vacation? As they arrived at the station, Sarah realized that this incident would become a defining story of her trip to London and possibly of her life. She had come to London seeking new experiences and memories, and she was certainly getting them, just not in the way she had expected. The real test would be how she handled the challenges that lay ahead, and what she learned from this unexpected turn of events. The police station on Victoria Street was busier than Sarah had expected for a Tuesday afternoon. Officers moved efficiently through the halls, dealing with various cases ranging from petty theft to more serious crimes. Sarah felt out of place in this environment, clutching her tourist map and camera bag while surrounded by the serious business of law enforcement. The reality of her situation was sinking in more deeply with each passing minute. Detective Inspector James Walsh was assigned to handle Sarah's case. A man in his early 40s with graying hair and tired eyes, he had dealt with countless incidents involving tourists and British landmarks over his 15-year career. He had seen everything from people trying to climb the gates of Buckingham Palace to individuals attempting to provoke reactions from the stoic royal guards. However, Sarah's case was different because of her immediate confession and obvious distress. The interview room was stark and functional, with pale green walls, a metal table, and 3 uncomfortable chairs. A recording device sat in the center of the table, and Sarah stared at it nervously as Detective Inspector Walsh prepared to take her formal statement. She had never been in a police station before, let alone as someone involved in an official investigation. "Before we begin," Walsh said, settling into his chair with a file folder, "I want you to understand that you're not under arrest. You're here voluntarily to help us understand exactly what happened this morning. You have the right to legal representation if you'd like, though given the nature of this incident, it may not be necessary." Sarah declined the offer of a lawyer, partly because she couldn't afford the additional expense, and partly because she believed her honesty would serve her better than legal maneuvering. She was determined to take full responsibility for her actions, even though they had been accidental. The detective began with basic information: her full name, address in Denver, passport details, and the purpose of her visit to London. As Sarah provided these details, she found herself relaxing slightly. The detective's manner was professional but not unkind, and she sensed that he was trying to understand her situation rather than simply punish her for it. "Tell me about your morning, from the time you woke up until the incident occurred," Walsh requested, turning on the recording device. Sarah recounted her day in detail, from her early wake-up time to her walk through London streets, her arrival at Buckingham Palace, and the gradual build-up of heat and crowd pressure that led to the accident. She was careful to include every detail she could remember, even small things like the German tour group's loud guide and the crying Japanese child, painting a picture of the chaotic conditions that had contributed to the incident. Detective Inspector Walsh listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in his file. His experience told him that Sarah's account had the ring of truth to it. False stories typically had either too few details or too many perfectly convenient ones. Sarah's narrative included the kind of random, uncomfortable details that people usually only remember from real experiences. "You mentioned being pushed by another tourist," Walsh said. "Can you describe this person at all?" Sarah tried to recall more details about the person who had bumped into her, but the memory remained frustratingly vague. She remembered the push being forceful and sudden, but in the crowded conditions and her focus on the ceremony, she hadn't paid attention to the individual responsible. She felt frustrated by her inability to provide more useful information about this crucial element of the incident. As the interview continued, Walsh explained the seriousness of what had occurred from a legal perspective. Assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard, even accidentally, fell under several different British laws. There were statutes related to interfering with military personnel, damaging government property, and disrupting official ceremonies. The fact that the incident occurred at Buckingham Palace, one of the most secure and symbolically important locations in Britain, added additional layers of legal complexity. However, Walsh continued, "The circumstances of your case are clearly different from someone who intentionally tried to provoke or harm a guard. Your immediate confession, obvious remorse, and the accidental nature of the incident will all be taken into consideration when determining the appropriate response." The detective then showed Sarah photographs that had been taken of the guard's uniform after the incident. The coffee stains were more extensive than she had realized, covering not just the front of the red tunic, but also affecting some of the decorative elements and brass buttons. The uniform would need professional cleaning, and depending on the type of fabric and the coffee's composition, it might need to be replaced entirely. Sarah felt a new wave of guilt as she saw the photographic evidence of her accident. The uniform represented centuries of tradition and military pride, and she had damaged it with her carelessness. The visual impact of the stains was much worse than what she had been able to see from her position in the crowd. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice small in the institutional setting of the interview room. Detective Inspector Walsh explained the process that would follow. Her statement would be reviewed by the Crown Prosecution Service, who would decide whether to pursue formal charges. Given the circumstances, Walsh believed that formal charges were unlikely, but there would still be administrative consequences. She would be required to pay for the cleaning or replacement of the damaged uniform, attend an educational session about British royal protocols, and write formal letters of apology. Additionally, the incident would be recorded in police databases, which could affect her ability to enter the United Kingdom in the future. While this wouldn't be a permanent ban, it would mean additional scrutiny during the immigration process for any future visits. As they discussed these consequences, Sarah found herself thinking about the young guard whose uniform she had stained. She asked Detective Inspector Walsh if she could know anything about how the incident had affected him personally. Would he face disciplinary action? Had this damaged his career prospects? The detective explained that he couldn't share specific details about military personnel, but he could tell her that guards were trained to handle various unexpected situations, including incidents involving tourists. The guard's professional response to the situation would likely be noted positively, even though his uniform had been damaged through no fault of his own. "Actually," Walsh said, consulting his notes, "the guard in question, Guardsman Thompson, specifically requested that we convey his understanding that the incident was accidental. He observed the crowded conditions and saw you being pushed by another tourist. His testimony actually supports your account of what happened. This information brought Sarah both relief and additional emotional complexity. Knowing that the guard himself understood it was an accident helped ease some of her guilt, but it also made her feel more connected to him as a person rather than just a symbol of British tradition. She realized she wanted to apologize to him personally, not just through formal letters. The interview continued for nearly 2 hours, covering every aspect of the incident and Sarah's background. Detective Inspector Walsh was thorough but fair, and by the end of the session, Sarah felt that he understood her situation completely. She had been honest about everything, from her excitement about the trip to her anxiety about the consequences of her accident. As they concluded the formal statement process, Walsh provided Sarah with information about what would happen next. She would receive official notification of the administrative penalties within 48 hours. The educational session about royal protocols would be scheduled for later that week, and she would need to complete all requirements before leaving the United Kingdom. One more thing, the detective said as they prepared to leave the interview room. The incident this morning has actually highlighted some safety concerns about crowd management during the changing of the guard ceremony. Your experience, while unfortunate for you personally, may lead to improvements that prevent similar accidents in the future. Sarah found this perspective somewhat comforting. If her embarrassing mistake could somehow contribute to making the experience safer for future tourists and guards, perhaps some good could come from the situation. As she left the police station, Sarah felt emotionally drained but also oddly relieved. The uncertainty about her fate was beginning to resolve, and while the consequences were serious, they were manageable. She had faced the legal system honestly and cooperatively, and that integrity was being recognized and respected. The London streets seemed different to her now. She was no longer just a tourist observing British culture from the outside. She had become part of a story that connected her to British institutions and legal processes in a way she had never expected. Her vacation had been transformed into something much more complex and meaningful, though not at all in the way she had planned. Walking back toward her hotel, Sarah began to think about the letters of apology she would need to write and the protocol education session she would attend. These weren't just administrative requirements. They were opportunities to learn more about the culture and traditions she had inadvertently disrupted. Her incident was becoming an education, though a costly and stressful one. 3 days after the incident, Sarah sat in a modest classroom within the British Army's London district headquarters, surrounded by materials about royal protocol, military tradition, and the history of the Queen's Guard. She was one of only 3 people attending this special educational session, which had been arranged as part of her administrative penalty. The other attendees included a businessman who had tried to shake hands with a guard and a teenager who had attempted to place a hat on a guard's head for a social media post. The instructor, Major Caroline Henderson, was a career military officer with an extensive background in both active service and diplomatic protocol. Her approach to the session was educational rather than punitive, focusing on helping the attendees understand why certain behaviors around royal guards were problematic and how they could be better tourists and cultural ambassadors in the future. The Queen's Guard, Major Henderson began, represents more than just ceremonial tradition. These are active military personnel with real security responsibilities. Their training and discipline serve both symbolic and practical purposes in protecting some of Britain's most important institutions. Sarah found herself genuinely fascinated by the information being presented. She learned about the rigorous selection process for guards, their extensive training in both ceremonial duties and practical security work, and the psychological preparation required to maintain composure under all circumstances. The young guardsman she had accidentally splashed had undergone months of intensive preparation to reach his post. The session covered the history of the Guard regiments, dating back centuries and including service in numerous conflicts around the world. Sarah realized that the tourists who tried to provoke reactions from the Guards were not just bothering individuals doing their jobs, but were disrespecting soldiers who had served their country with distinction in some of the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Major Henderson showed video footage of various tourist incidents over the years, ranging from harmless but inappropriate photo attempts to more serious disruptions of ceremonies. Sarah was relieved to see that her coffee spill incident was relatively minor compared to some of the intentional provocations that guards regularly faced. However, she also understood better why even accidental incidents required serious response. The public's interaction with the Queen's Guard is a privilege, not a right, the Major explained. These ceremonies are not tourist entertainment, though the public is welcome to observe respectfully. They are military operations with real security implications and cultural significance that extends far beyond what most visitors realize. During a break in the session, Sarah approached Major Henderson with questions about Guardsman Thompson, the young soldier whose uniform she had stained. She wanted to know if her letter of apology had been delivered and whether there was any way she could make additional amends for the incident. Major Henderson's expression softened slightly as she recognized the genuine remorse in Sarah's voice. "Your letter was very well received," she said. "Guardsman Thompson was actually quite impressed with your immediate confession and cooperation with the investigation. It's rare for tourists to take that level of responsibility for their actions." The Major went on to explain that the uniform damage had been less severe than initially feared. Professional cleaning had removed most of the coffee stains, and only minor touch-up work had been required. The cost of the cleaning and restoration, which Sarah would pay as part of her penalty, was much less than the full replacement cost that had initially been feared. "There is something else you should know," Major Henderson continued. "Guardsman Thompson specifically requested that we share his appreciation for your handling of the situation. In his words, your response turned what could have been a negative incident into an example of how people should take responsibility for their mistakes." This information brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Throughout the days since the incident, she had been carrying guilt and worry about how her accident had affected the young soldier. Learning that he not only understood the accidental nature of what happened but actually respected her response was emotionally overwhelming. As the educational session continued, Sarah found herself thinking about the broader implications of her experience. Her accidental encounter with British law enforcement and military protocol had taught her more about the country's culture and values than any guidebook or tourist attraction could have provided. She was seeing Britain from the inside, understanding how its institutions actually functioned when faced with problems and challenges. The session concluded with each attendee writing a reflective essay about what they had learned and how they would apply that knowledge in the future. Sarah's essay turned into several pages of thoughtful analysis about respect, responsibility, and the importance of understanding cultural contexts when traveling. Major Henderson later commented that it was one of the most insightful pieces she had received from these sessions. On her final day in London, Sarah received permission to return to Buckingham Palace, not as a tourist this time, but to deliver her formal letter of apology to the appropriate military authorities. The letter had gone through several drafts, each one attempting to capture her genuine remorse, while also expressing her newfound appreciation for the traditions and people she had inadvertently affected. Standing once again in front of the palace gates, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her perspective had changed in just 1 week. The building no longer represented just a tourist destination or a symbol of royal glamour. She now understood it as a working military and administrative facility where real people carried out serious responsibilities under constant public scrutiny. The guard on duty that afternoon was not Guardsman Thompson, but Sarah found herself looking at him with completely different eyes. Instead of seeing a costumed performer for tourist entertainment, she saw a trained soldier maintaining both security and tradition under challenging circumstances. His stillness was not just showmanship, but professional discipline of the highest order. As she handed over her letter to the military liaison officer, Sarah felt a sense of closure beginning to form around the incident. She had faced the consequences of her actions honestly, learned valuable lessons about cultural respect and personal responsibility, and hopefully contributed to better understanding between tourists and the institutions they visit. The financial penalty for her incident totaled £450, covering the uniform cleaning, administrative costs, and the educational session. While this was a significant expense for her vacation budget, Sarah recognized it as fair compensation for the trouble she had caused. More importantly, she felt that the education and personal growth she had gained from the experience was worth far more than the money she had paid. On her flight back to Denver, Sarah found herself writing in her journal about the lessons she had learned. The incident had transformed what was supposed to be a simple vacation into a profound learning experience about accountability, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of understanding the context and significance of the places and traditions we encounter as travelers. She also realized that her story would serve as a valuable lesson for other tourists. Through her mistake and the way she had handled its consequences, she had learned things about respectful travel and cultural awareness that she wanted to share with others. Her accidental assault on a royal guard with coffee had become an educational opportunity that extended far beyond her own experience. 6 months after returning home, Sarah received an unexpected letter forwarded through the British Embassy. It was from Guardsman Thompson himself, who had taken the initiative to write and thank her for her exemplary handling of their unfortunate encounter. He mentioned that her case had become a training example for how both tourists and guards should handle accidental incidents, and that her immediate honesty and cooperation had set a positive standard. The guard's letter included an invitation for Sarah to return to London for a proper, formal viewing of the changing of the guard ceremony, with arrangements for a respectful meet and greet afterward. This gesture of reconciliation and friendship transformed what had begun as Sarah's most embarrassing moment into one of the most meaningful connections of her life. Sarah's story became a popular anecdote among her friends and family, but not in the way she had initially feared. Rather than being a tale of tourist incompetence and legal trouble, it became an inspiring example of how to handle mistakes with grace, learn from cultural misunderstandings, and turn negative situations into opportunities for growth and connection. When she did return to London the following year, Sarah approached the experience with a completely different mindset. She understood the significance of what she was observing, respected the boundaries between tourists and working military personnel, and appreciated the privilege of witnessing these ancient traditions. Her accidental coffee attack had made her a better traveler and a more culturally aware person. The young guard she met properly that second time was no longer just a symbol of British tradition to her, but a fellow human being doing important work under challenging circumstances. Their handshake and brief conversation represented the successful transformation of an embarrassing accident into mutual understanding and respect. Sarah's coffee cup incident had taught them both valuable lessons about forgiveness, responsibility, and the power of honest human connection across cultural boundaries.